So hello everybody, welcome back again. This time we are looking at chapter 13, and this is the chapter that covers the other type of cell division that is associated with eukaryotes. And this type of cell division is specifically associated with sexual reproduction. And you might ask, so why do we need a second type of cell division if we already have mitosis? What can't mitosis do that requires that we have a second type of cell division? And the answer is reasonably simple, but it's also kind of complicated as well. So you'll see. So the first thing to remember is that if you are an asexually reproducing organism, you can legitimately go ahead and use mitosis as your means of reproducing. In fact, you do. And so whether you be a multi-celled organism or a single-celled organism, if you want to make an identical copy of yourself, mitosis is the way to do it. Because hopefully you recall from our discussion of mitosis last week, the whole point behind mitosis is to produce cells that are genetically identical to themselves and also are genetically identical to the parent cell. And therein lies the issue with asexual reproduction. Because while it is a way of rapidly reproducing, and no one can argue that an asexually reproducing organism can reproduce rapidly, just look at bacteria because they use asexual reproduction. You can't argue that they don't reproduce quickly. They most certainly do. And any organism that relies on asexual reproduction can reproduce in large numbers very, very quickly. The big problem is that they are all genetically identical. And that does not bode well for survival, or at least long-term survival of a species. In fact, one of the big issues that we confront today with a number of species that are listed as endangered and threatened with extinction is simply a loss of genetic diversity. They are too genetically similar to each other to be able to successfully reproduce long-term. And that is at the heart of why asexually reproducing organisms don't typically have a long-term success. It comes down to lack of genetic diversity. Now, we'll talk at the end of this chapter about a group of organisms that seem to be thumbing their nose at that whole notion. But as I'll show you, there is a really good reason why they can. And yes, they have been asexually reproducing, we estimate, for the best part of 50 million years, which, based on what we know about asexual reproduction, basically what I've just told you, is impossible. Yet they're sitting there going, ha, 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 we are doing it. And therefore, there must be a way for them to do it. And it's actually quite a cool party trick that they have, but more of that at the end of the chapter. So the big drawback of asexual reproduction is that everyone's genetically identical. And so sexual reproduction for the vast majority of species on our planet is the way in which they choose to reproduce. Even many species that typically will reproduce asexually while the environment is friendly and benign and unchanging, will, if the environment changes, which it is almost certainly going to do at some point, they may very well revert to a form of sexual reproduction. They reserve the right to reproduce sexually when things get tough. And that's the whole point behind sexual reproduction. It creates genetic diversity, something that asexual reproduction does not do particularly well. And the reason why, apart from the fact that cells are genetically identical to each other and to the parental cells, is that the only source of genetic variation that asexually reproducing organisms can count on is mutation, because mutation provides them with alternative versions of the genes. But as we will learn over the course of the next couple of chapters, mutations generally have a very bad track record. Very few mutations lead to something that is beneficial. The vast majority of mutations lead to something that is detrimental and gets eliminated pretty quickly. Some mutations lead to genes that are essentially neutral, neither beneficial or detrimental. And so natural selection really has no effect on the occurrence of those genes in a particular organism that may have them. But sometimes, very rarely, a mutation actually leads to a beneficial gene. And that accounts for some of the genetic diversity that we see in asexually reproducing organisms. But it's the only type of genetic diversity that they can routinely count on. There's not really that much other source of genetic variation. So it poses a real problem. So these slides, and you can download the slide set from the resources page, basically go through some of those ideas. What we should talk about is why sexual reproduction is really the favored type of sexual reproduction. And the answer is somewhat complicated, as you'll come to understand. But the basic principle is that because we, as sexually reproducing organisms, we get a genetic contribution from both of our parents. There is now the possibility for creating different combinations of genetic material in the offspring because both parents are making a contribution. We're not just relying on the genetic contribution of a single parent. We're relying on the genetic contribution of both parents. So that immediately tells us that when we look at our chromosomal content, whatever that may be, some of that chromosomal content comes from one parent, and the other part of the chromosomal content comes from the other parent. And in fact, as you'll come to recognize, we basically get a set of chromosomes from our mother and a set of chromosomes from our father. And so when we look at any of the cells in our body, what are referred to as somatic cells, those cells in their nucleus actually contain two complete sets of chromosomes. And I'll show you visual evidence for that a little bit later in the presentation, after we've had our first, I believe it's after we have our first break, in fact. But the point is that both of our parents are making a contribution. So we need to start looking at some terms that we will utilize over the course of this chapter. So there are two terms that we utilize to talk about chromosome content. So the first term is diploid, and these will be defined again a little bit later in the presentation, but I want to introduce these now so we can start using them. Diploid refers to the fact that there are two complete sets of chromosomes. And this is the typical chromosomal makeup of our general body cells. So all of the cells that are in our body, other than the reproductive cells, eggs and sperm, depending on gender. All of those cells, the somatic cells, are diploid. They have two complete sets of chromosomes. And again, not really difficult to imagine where those two sets come from, considering that we are the product of the genetic contributions of both of our parents. We get one set of chromosomes from our mother, one set of chromosomes from our father. So now we need a second term, and that term is haploid. To talk about the other chromosomal condition, and that's what the condition of the reproductive cells, or what are known as gametes, umbrella term. That's the umbrella term for eggs and sperm. So that is one complete set of chromosomes. And that's basically what we get from each parent. We get one complete set of chromosomes, or a haploid set of chromosomes, from our mother, and one complete set of chromosomes from our father. So as we start to think about mitosis, we think about the nature of the mitotic cell division. It becomes immediately obvious that mitosis simply can't accomplish that, because the cells that are the product of mitosis have two complete sets of chromosomes. That's the whole point. They are genetically identical to the parental cell as much as they are genetically identical to each other. And they have two complete sets of chromosomes. They have the diploid number of chromosomes. They are, to all intents and purposes, somatic cells, body cells. But if you're a single cell organism, that's still the case. You're still diploid. Your offspring will be diploid so long as you are reproducing asexually, so long as you're reproducing by mitosis. What we need then is not a cell division that will give us cells that are genetically identical to each other and are genetically identical to the parent. What we need is a type of cell division that will give us one complete set of chromosomes rather than two complete sets of chromosomes, something that mitosis simply cannot do. Hence the need for meiosis. Meiosis is the type of cell division that is associated with sexual reproduction, and the reason why is because it accomplishes what we need. It reduces the number of chromosomes in the reproductive cells, the gametes, the eggs and sperm, to one complete set of chromosomes, the haploid number. And it does so in such a way that the set of chromosomes that get passed on are very typically a combination of the chromosomes that you got from your mother and the chromosomes that you got from your father. It would be very, very unusual for you to pass on to your offspring just the set of chromosomes that you got from your father, or just the set of chromosomes that you got from your mother. The way meiosis functions, the way it operates, is to mix up the chromosomes as part of the process so that the set of chromosomes that you pass on to your offspring are a combination of some of the chromosomes from your mother's set and some of the chromosomes from your father's set to make up a new set of chromosomes that you pass on to your offspring. And out of that comes the part of the understanding of the genetic variation that is produced by sexual reproduction because of this, the way meiosis functions. So hopefully you're starting to see that meiosis is a very, very important type of cell division. In fact, it is going to be the basis of everything that we discuss in the next two chapters that are all about inheritance and inheritance patterns. Because whatever we see as inheritance patterns as a result of sexual reproduction, which is where we see inheritance patterns, because again, if you're reproducing asexually, all you're going to do is pass on the same set of characteristics that you have to your offspring, because they're going to be genetically identical to you. So when we start thinking in terms of genetic variation and inheritance patterns that explain those variations, we immediately have to make a connection to whatever cell division is at the heart of sexual reproduction, and that happens to be meiosis. So as we're going to be discussing inheritance patterns in chapters 14 and 15, it's really important here in chapter 13 to come to terms with meiosis, because we're going to have to apply what we know about meiosis to those inheritance patterns to be able to explain where they come from. Because those inheritance patterns in the end must be explainable by behavior of the chromosomes as we observe their behavior in meiosis. So I'm giving you an extended introduction here, but I want to reinforce again that there is a reason for looking at meiosis at this stage in the semester, because this is going to be fundamental to our understanding of the next two chapters, and to some degree, our understanding of chapters 16 and 17. Not so much 16 and 17, but it does have a carryover effect into looking at 16 and 17 as well. So yeah, meiosis is kind of important. So here's a couple of examples of organisms that you may not have recognized actually reproduce asexually, because they are multicellular, and you might think, well, they're going to reproduce sexually. But in fact, in the case of Hydra, all they do is reproduce asexually. And you can see the little juvenile Hydra here. This thing called the bud, it's actually being produced by mitosis off the side of the body of the parental Hydra. And eventually, when it gets large enough so that it can feed itself independently, it will break loose, settle down on a rock, and start coping with life by itself. Eventually, if it wants to reproduce, it'll do the same thing again. Will this parent reproduce again? Most likely. And when it does, it's going to produce buds, because the only way that the Hydra can reproduce is asexually. This is a clump of redwoods, and all of these redwoods are actually clones of each other. They're also clones of the parental tree, which unfortunately has died off. You can see the stump sitting here in the middle. It rotted out and fell over, and if you look very carefully, you can see the trunk extending out here. But all of these daughter trees are derived from what are called water buds. These are little trees that have grown off the roots of the original parental tree. And they are literally clones of the original parental tree, and they are genetically identical to each other, and they're genetically identical to the original parental tree. And so this is a way for redwoods to reproduce themselves very rapidly, just by producing these little seedlings, or these little treelets, I guess. It would be incorrect to call them seedlings, because I didn't develop from a seed. Can a redwood develop from a seed? Oh yeah, sure, it can develop from a seed as well. But that requires a male and a female part of the tree. It is a conifer, so it produces cones, and there is a male cone and a female cone. And the male cone produces pollen that is carried by the wind to the female cone. It takes 3 years for that life cycle to play out, for the new seeds to develop and to be released, and for the little seedlings to have a chance to get going. But of course, the little seedlings have to fight the adult trees in order to make some headway and get access to light and be able to grow. In this case, the clones can rely on resources from the parental tree until they are large enough to fend for themselves. So there is a real advantage for the redwood to reproduce itself asexually. But of course, there is the downside of everyone's genetically identical to each other, no genetic diversity. If something should change in the environment, which it always does, then these clones, if one of them gets hurt, they'll all get hurt. If one of them dies, they'll all die, because they're genetically identical. So when we start looking at sexual reproduction, we have to recognize that there is an involvement of 2 parents and a genetic contribution from both parents. And so this makes up the sexual life cycle. Now, you're very familiar with the animal life cycle, because it's the same life cycle that we follow. We are, after all, animals. So the animal life cycle is very, very familiar, where the parental animals are diploid. Their somatic cells are diploid, their body cells are diploid, but within the body, there are cells that will undergo meiosis. And as we've seen, meiosis is all about reducing the number of chromosomes from the diploid number to the haploid number for the purposes of reproduction. The 2 gametes that are involved, the eggs and the sperm, then come together at fertilization to recover and reform the diploid combination, and that gives rise to a cell called the zygote. And you and I and every other animal on the planet that reproduces asexually began with this zygote. We talked about this last week. And the whole point of mitosis in the sexual life cycle is for the purpose of reproducing the zygote as genetically identical cells and constantly having cell division that produces genetically identical cells that are identical to each other and identical to the parental cell. In other words, have a complete set of the chromosomes. And that gives rise to the somatic cells that eventually make up the body of the adult animal, whatever it happens to be. In this case, we're talking about a mouse. And you're familiar with this. And the problem with people who go on, or for people who go on to take advanced biology classes, is that you encounter other types of reproductive life cycles. Now, in this class, it's not particularly important that you understand the variations of sexual life cycle, but I am going to show them to you just so that you recognize that the animal way of doing things is not necessarily the only way, and in fact, it's not the most common way of sexually reproducing. As you'll see, the other two life cycles are kind of variations of each other, and they are very different from the animal life cycle. But if it is your intention to go on and take general biology too, and to take more advanced biology classes, you're going to have to deal with the fact that the animal life cycle, as much as that's the one that we focus on in this class, it's the one that everyone is most familiar with. It's not necessarily the only way of reproducing sexually, and it is most definitely not the most common way of reproducing sexually. So let's take a look at the other two ways of doing it very quickly so that we can go on and finish talking about meiosis. So in the case of plants and some algae, we still have a diploid stage. And depending on the types of plants, the diploid stage may be the dominant form of the plant, or it may be a transitory form of the plant. So here in mosses, we actually have a transitory diploid stage. That sounds really weird. It would be kind of like we as humans lived the vast majority of our life as an egg or a sperm, and only temporarily and very transitorily existed in our adult form. That lasted sort of like that, and then it was gone. And that for the vast majority of time, our life was spent as an egg or a sperm in a haploid form. That is what a lot of plants actually do. And mosses, hornworts, liverworts, all have this focus on being majority haploid, and a lot of algae do the same thing. And so when you take a look at a moss growing on the side of a tree, what you're actually, or on a rock or wherever you see a moss, what you're actually looking at is something called a gametophyte, and it's actually haploid. So that's this stage. And meiosis, notice, doesn't produce eggs and sperm. It doesn't produce gametes. It produces something called spores. The spores then grow into the gametophyte. So what makes a gametophyte unusual is that it's a very large multicellular structure, but all of those cells are haploid, and all of those cells have been produced by mitosis because they're genetically identical to each other, and they're genetically identical to their parent cell. So when you look at a moss, the moss body is produced by mitosis, and the cells are haploid. Very different. Somewhere within the gametophyte structure, however, is a structure that will produce gametes, either eggs or sperm, and they will eventually get together through fertilization to give rise to a zygote. Nothing mysterious here. That zygote then grows into a structure referred to as the sporophyte, because it's going to make spores through meiosis. And it is this little structure, we call this a capsule, that grows out of the gametophyte. This is so transitory that it doesn't even bother to do photosynthesis. It simply gets its energy from the gametophyte that it's growing on. It produces spores through meiosis and releases the spores back into the environment to produce the next generation of gametophytes. It's a very different way of doing things. And one of the things that I notice when I teach general biology too, which I've been doing for many years now, is that when we start talking about plants, we start talking about different types of life cycles. This is where everyone starts to struggle, because we get so fixated on the animal way of doing things. And there are other ways of doing things other than the animal way. So this is one alternative. The other alternative is what fungi and some protists do, and that is, again, be very much haploid, but only be diploid as a zygote. And the zygote, once it forms, almost immediately undergoes meiosis to produce either haploid cells that live independently and are the organism, or produce spores that develop into something that is going to be haploid for the whole of the life of the organism. So when you eat a mushroom is what is referred to as a fruiting body, a reproductive structure for fungus that is growing underground. And that contains haploid nuclei. And the vast majority of fungi that we eat, whether they be mushrooms, morels, truffles, whatever type of fungus it is that you're eating, that stage that you're eating is almost certainly haploid, or at least contains haploid nuclei. And that is something very, very different. Again, the actual diploid stage is very, very transitory. Typically, it's just a single cell that is diploid and it undergoes meiosis almost immediately to produce haploid cells that are the cells that are going to produce the adult, and the adult will be haploid. So this is another alternative way of doing or having a sexual life cycle and reproducing sexually for the purpose of producing genetic variation. You can see that these are very, very different from the animal life cycle that we are so familiar with, the life cycle that we follow. So we need to just bear this in mind. In fact, those of you who are going on into the health sciences, when you do your microbiology course and you talk a little bit about fungi, which you will do in your microbiology course, you may actually touch on the fungal life cycle, because there are fungi that are very relevant to people in the life sciences, and some of the most cringe-producing illustrations and photographs that I have ever seen are of fungal infections. These are not pretty. And fungi can do some really nasty things when it comes to infecting humans. So understanding the fungal life cycle actually is possibly something that you will have to do when you get to your micro course. Anyway, that's sexual reproduction compared to asexual reproduction. You can see now, because of this necessity to go from a diploid starting cell to a haploid reproductive cell, the egg and the sperm, why it's necessary to have a different type of cell division. Mitosis simply can't do that. So we need a different type of cell division. That's where meiosis comes in. So that brings us to our first break today. So here are our concept questions. Remember, or concept check questions. I will answer these questions on the other side of the break. So, how does an asexually reproducing organism produce offspring that are genetically identical to each other and to the parent? And here's a more application type question. You want to produce many copies of the very popular new orchid. And most orchids that you buy on the roadside are produced this way. What should you do? Breed it with another identical orchid, or clone it? I'll see you on the other side of the break with the answers.